Chapter 2. Victor continues his education. When I was 17, my parents said that I should go to the University of Ingolstadt. My father thought that I should learn other customs than those of my native country. Before I could leave for Germany, however, the first great sorrow of my life occurred. Perhaps it was a hint of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught scarlet fever. Her illness was severe, and she was in the greatest danger. My mother was able to nurse her back to health, but the result was fatal. On the third day, my mother sickened, and she continued to get worse as time went by. On her deathbed, she joined my hands with Elizabeth's. Then she said, "My children, I have always hoped that you would someday marry. This hope for your marriage will now comfort your father. We shall all meet again in another world." She died calmly, and her face showed affection even in death. I need not describe the grief we felt. Why should I describe a sorrow that all have felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief must give way to life. My mother was dead, but we still had duties to perform and lives to live. The day of my departure for Ingolstadt finally arrived. Clerval spent the last evening with us. He had tried to persuade his father to let him study at Ingolstadt too. However, his father could not be convinced. He was a narrow-minded traitor who saw nothing but ruin in the hopes and ambitions of his son. Clerval, however, was committed not to be chained to the miserable details of business. In the morning I went to the carriage that was to carry me away. They were all there. My father again blessed me, Clerval pressed my hand once more, and my Elizabeth gave me a kiss. The journey to Ingolstadt was long and tiring. Finally, the high, white steeple of the town met my eyes. I was taken to my apartment to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction and visited some of the professors. I first met M. Kremp, professor of natural philosophy. He asked me questions about what I already knew. When I mentioned the authors I had read, he said, "Have you really spent your time on such nonsense? Every minute you wasted on those books is entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with useless names. In what desert land did you live? Was no one kind enough to tell you that these ideas are as musty as they are ancient? My dear sir, you must begin your studies anew." So saying, he wrote a list of several books for me to read. M. Cramp was a little squat man with a gruff voice and an ugly face. I didn't like him very much, so I wasn't eager to begin reading any of the books he recommended. Before the first week had ended, however, I did meet a professor I liked. His name was M. Waldman. He was about 50 years old with a friendly face. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His voice was the sweetest I had ever heard. His first lecture was about the history of chemistry. He then talked about the present state of the science. He ended with words I will never forget. He said, "The ancient teachers of this science promised the impossible and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They knew that metals cannot be changed and that life is a mystery. Even so, these modern scientists have indeed performed miracles. They have discovered how the blood circulates. They have learned the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. Who knows what future discoveries they might make?" Such were the professor's words. As he spoke, I felt as if my soul were fighting with an enemy. Soon my mind was filled with one thought, one idea, one purpose. "So much has been done," exclaimed my soul. "More, far more will I achieve. I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation." I made up my mind to return to my ancient studies. I wanted to devote myself to a science for which I believed I had a natural talent. The next day, I paid M. Waldman a visit. He was even more pleasant at home than he was in the lecture hall. I told him about my previous studies. When he heard the names Agrippa and Paracelsus, he smiled, but without the contempt M. Crape had shown. He said, "Those men laid the foundations of modern science, even though their work came to nothing. They were the men of genius whose zeal can still inspire us." I asked for his advice concerning the books I ought to read. M. Waldman said, "If you want to be a man of science, you must study every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics." He then took me into his laboratory. He explained to me the uses of his various machines. He told me which ones I ought to buy for myself. He promised me the use of his own when I was advanced enough not to break them. He also gave me the list of books that I had requested. Thus ended a day I shall never forget. It decided my future. From that day, natural philosophy and particularly chemistry became nearly my sole occupation. I read every book I could find on these subjects. I attended the lectures of and became acquainted with the men of science of the university. In M. Waldman, I found a true friend and a fine teacher. In 1,000 ways, he made it easier for me to learn. He answered every question clearly in a way that was easy to understand. I became such an eager student. The stars often disappeared in the light of morning while I was still working in my laboratory. 2 years passed in this way, during which I paid no visit to Geneva. I was busy, heart and soul, in the pursuit of some discoveries that I hoped to make. Only those who have experienced it can understand the fascination of science. In other studies, you go as far as those who have gone before you. There is nothing more to know. In science, however, there is a continual food for discovery and wonder. At the end of 2 years, I had learned all that the professors at Ingolstadt could teach me. I thought of returning to my friends in my hometown. Then something happened that made me stay. One of my favorite subjects was the structure of the human frame, and indeed that of any living animal. What I often asked myself was the cause of life. It was a bold question, one that has never been considered a mystery. To examine the causes of life, we must first study death. I began to study the science of anatomy, but this was not enough. I also studied the natural decay and breakdown of the human body upon death. I had never been frightened by tales of supernatural horrors, superstition, and ghosts. A cemetery to me was just a place for bodies deprived of life, bodies that were now food for worms. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay. I spent days and nights in vaults and burial houses. I saw how the fine form of the human body was destroyed and wasted. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and brain. In the midst of this darkness, a sudden idea came to me. It was brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple. I became dizzy just thinking about what it meant. So many men of genius had studied the same science. I was surprised that I alone would discover so astonishing a secret. Remember that I am not recording the vision of madman. What I say is as true as the fact that the sun shines in the sky. After days and nights of incredible work, I discovered the cause of life. More than that, I became capable myself of giving life to lifeless matter. I see by the look on your face, my friend, that you expect me to tell you the secret. That cannot be. Listen to my story and you will learn why I cannot tell you. Learn from me, if not by what I say, then at least by example, how dangerous this secret is. When I found this power placed in my hands, I thought a long time about the best way to use it. Although I could give life easily, preparing a frame for it, with all its fibers, muscles, and veins, was not so easy. I doubted at first whether I should try to create a being like myself, but I soon changed my mind. I knew I could succeed. I made up my mind to make a huge man, about 8 feet tall and proportionately large. I began to gather the parts I would need. My workshop was a solitary room at the top of the house. It was separated from all other apartments by the staircase. I collected bones from burial houses. The dissecting room and the slaughterhouse also furnished many of my materials. The work all summer on this one pursuit, I forgot about everything else. I even neglected to write letters to my father, Elizabeth, and Clerval. I knew that my silence upset them, but I could not tear myself away from my work. I know now that human beings should never allow passion to disturb their peace. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If your studies destroy your taste for simple pleasures and family affections, then those studies are wrong. If this rule were always followed, Greece would not have fallen. Caesar would have spared this country, and America would have been discovered more gradually. But I will go on with my story. I continued my work. Another year passed, and I did not even notice the changing of the seasons. I was obsessed with my work. I shunned my fellow beings as if I had been guilty of a crime. Every day brought me closer to success, and I promised myself that I would enjoy some exercise and amusement as soon as my creation was complete.